As we face climate upheavals, lessons from the end of the late Bronze Age of ancient Egypt. The accelerating climate that humanity confronts today is not the first instance of environmental adaptation. Historical climatology and auxiliary archaeological data offer critical lessons from past societies that endured comparable environmental crises. The end of the Late Bronze Age, circa 1200 BCE, marked a period of widespread instability and transformation for the interconnected civilizations of Egypt and the Near East. Empires that had dominated the region for centuries, including the Mycenaeans, Hittites, and the New Kingdom of Egypt, faced sudden contraction or collapse under combined pressures of drought, famine, warfare, and economic strain. Among these, Egypt's New Kingdom proposes a compelling example of significant transformation. Once the dominant imperial power of the Near East, its weakening at the close of the Late Bronze Age demonstrates how environmental change, social complexity, and decision-making synthesize to reshape an entire civilization. The Egyptian experience demonstrates a central lesson for our current era of ecological crises. Survival depends not on preserving systems at all costs, but on adapting them to changing environments. Environmental data from the Eastern Mediterranean suggests that the Late Bronze Age collapse coincided with a period of severe and sustained drought. Pollen and isotype analysis from the Nile Delta and Levant indicate that a century-long arid episode between circa 1250 and 1100 BCE disrupted agricultural productivity and reduced the Nile's annual flood levels. Because the New Kingdom's wealth and stability were intrinsically tied to the Nile's rhythm, which supported grain cultivation and taxation, even small climatic shifts could have cascading effects. Diminished floods meant that food shortages, economic decline, and growing discontent amongst Egypt's population. In Kanowski's perspective, such drought episodes were not merely background conditions, but primary triggers for social and political upheaval in the Late Bronze Age. As the climate worsened, Egypt's imperial response illustrates a familiar modern dilemma, doubling down on centralized control rather than promoting adaptive decentralization. The pharaohs of the late 19th and 20th dynasties sought to preserve order through large-scale construction, state-directed agriculture, and costly military campaigns. However, as Diamond observes, complex systems built to maintain control in stable environments often become liabilities when these environments change. This phenomenon is consistent in world history. For example, the classic Maya collapse, whose resilience upon labor-intensive agriculture systems saw decline in the 7th to 9th centuries CE, likely due to famines which discredited the political entities of the region, leaving them weak and unstable, resulting in the subsequent warfare and violence for Egypt. Its rigid bureaucracy, temple-based economy, and hierarchical power structure left little room for local communities to innovate or adapt independently. The Egyptian system's strength is its ability to centralize resources and command labor, but like iron, it is strong. and it breaks instead of a more decentralized system that bends. It is the very strength of the system that becomes its weakness when faced with ecological instability and resource scarcity. The interconnected nature of the late Bronze Age world magnified Egypt's vulnerability. Its prosperity depended not only on the Nile, but also on international trade networks that linked the Mediterranean economies. When neighboring states, particularly the Hittite Empire and Ugarit, collapsed under the strain of famine and invasion, Egypt's access to key resources such as tin, copper, and imported grain was disrupted. Inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu may suggest a desperate struggle against the sea peoples, whose migrations were likely driven by famine and climate displacement. Although Egypt repelled these invasions militarily, the cost was immense, draining the treasury and exhausting an already overextended state. The resulting economic and demographic stress further weakened Egypt's ability to sustain its empire. Despite this, unlike many of its contemporaries, Egypt did not experience a total collapse. Instead, the new kingdom's decline unfolded as a gradual process of transformation, showing that even rigid systems can adapt under pressure. The transition to the third intermediate period, beginning circa 1070 BCE, marked a shift from a centralized imperial economy to a more regional and pluralistic order. Power decentralized into local and priestly authorities, particularly around Thebes and the Delta, and Egypt's administrative and religious structures reconfigured to operate at smaller scale. As Weiss and others note in their study of early Mesopotamian societies and collapses, resilience often manifests through reorganization rather than endurance. Egypt's adaptive contraction demonstrates that flexibility is the true foundation of resilience. The ecological dimension of this transformation is equally revealing. Environmental and social upheaval destabilized the long-held principle of Ma'at, the cosmic order maintained by the pharaoh. As royal authority weakened, local temples and priesthoods emerged as new centers of stability, providing food, ritual continuity, and economic coordination. Rather than presenting mere decline, the spiritual decentralization reflected cultural adaptation. Egyptians reshaped their religious and moral framework to fit a world of reduced central power, preserving meaning and cohesion amid disorder. This process parallels how modern societies must rethink their values in light of ecological limits. Sustainable adaptations requires not only technological innovation, but also cultural reorientation. The technological change during and after the period of the Bronze Age collapse is fascinating and links to the themes of change and adaptation. The technological innovations after the period facilitated the contraction of the large formalized states such as Egypt and the Hittite Empire. The development of ironworking and horseback riding democratizes power, moving it away from the political elites who had dominated Bronze Age societies. The resources required to produce bronze and chariots had previously promoted a highly interconnected and centralized world. Long-distance trade, particularly tin, a key component of bronze, encouraged communication and economic interdependence. To support the use of chariots, which were devastating weapons of the age, complex bureaucratic systems were necessary to produce and maintain these instruments of war. However, the emergence of horses large enough to be ridden, along with advances in horsemanship and the widespread availability of iron, reduced the dominance of these centralized systems. Unlike chariots, ridden horses did not require extensive state-sponsored industries to sustain them and could move in rough terrain. Furthermore, iron ore was far more common than the tin needed for bronze. As a result, warfare could be conducted independently from long-distance trade networks, and the material of war, iron, was no longer under the exclusive control of the state. In distinction to this trend, Egypt appears not to have embraced iron technology to the same extent as the Near East. This reluctance may reflect the relative safety afforded by Egypt's geographical isolation, allowing it to maintain stability even as the other Bronze Age civilizations collapsed. It wasn't until the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the development of professional standing armies capable of mastering horseback warfare that the advantages of empire and centralized bureaucracy re-emerged as dominant forces in the ancient Near East. In many ways, the ancient Egyptian experience mirrors the challenges of the 21st century. Our global economy, like Egypt's imperial system, depends on predictable environmental patterns and interconnected trade. As those systems come under pressure from climate change, droughts, floods, resource depletion, and mass displacement, we face a similar decision: cling to centralized structures of control or adapt through flexibility and cooperation. Angel's analysis of early agricultural populations captures this enduring truth. Resilience is expressed not in avoiding crisis, but in showing energy under pressure. Egypt's transformation from empire to a constellation of local powers illustrates that even after environmental catastrophe, social and cultural continuity is possible when societies embrace adaptive change. As we face climate upheavals today, the lessons of Egypt's New Kingdom are critical. Civilizations that endure are those willing to restructure their relationship with the environment. The late Bronze Age collapse demonstrates that climate change is not just a natural phenomenon, but a test of political, economic, and moral flexibility. Like the ancient Egyptians, we must learn to decentralize power, diversify resources, and reimagine our values to sustain balance with our ecological world. The past warns us that ignoring environmental limits leads to transformation by necessity rather than by choice.